Good morning and welcome to this recorded presentation, PowerShell Singapore number 4. My name is Matt Hitchcock and I'm a PowerShell MVP and lead or co-lead of the Singapore PowerShell User Group. I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's presenter, Steven Murawski from Chef, and he'll be presenting on desired state configuration in the real world. We were lucky to have Steven with us as he's probably one of the most battle-hardened DSC people that there is, having adopted it very early, implemented it into large production environments, and worked with the PowerShell team to iron out any early problems they ran into. As a result, he has a lot of information and a lot of knowledge that he shared with us, and that means that the presentation you're about to watch is nearly 2 hours long. So if you are planning to watch it in one hit, you need to allow for that time. I've actually watched this presentation about 2 more times, and it worked really well for me to watch it in chunks on the train to work and from work. Watching it in chunks also allowed me time to process what I had taken in. I mentioned that there is a heck of a lot of information here, but it's all very, very valuable. So with that, I'll hand over to Steven, and I look forward to seeing you at the next PowerShell.
All right. So welcome to the 4th PowerShell Breakfast. As Matt said, you guys have had 3 good guests so far, and so now it's time to break the streak and have an alternating. But thank you guys for inviting me to talk a little bit about PowerShell DSC. And what I'm going to do tonight, or this morning, it's nighttime for me, what I'm going to do this morning for you guys, I'm going to share a little story about my experience implementing desired state configuration at Stack Exchange from the early preview up through general availability and just up to when I left a few weeks back. And afterwards, we have some time for some demo, but throughout, please interrupt with questions and anything that's not I'm not making clear. Well, let's dive into it and go. And for the length of this meeting, I'm your guys. So let's hopefully you can learn a little bit from my pain and also get some interesting ideas for what you can do with desired state configuration in your environments. So just a little bit about me. I am a community manager at Chef as of a couple weeks ago. Prior to that, I was a sysadmin on the site reliability team at Stack Exchange, which is where I got to do a lot of this desired state configuration stuff. I'm a Microsoft MVP in PowerShell, and you can find me at my blog, stevenmurawski.com, or at Steven Murawski on Twitter. I'm kind of all over the place, so you can find me out on the intertubes somewhere. I've also started running office hours, so there's a couple of days a week where I set aside some time at O hours, and I should probably have added that link there to it, but there's a link on the blog to on my website to the O hours times that I have available there for questions and answers on DSC, Chef. I might not be able to answer it, but I can at least point you in a direction to look. All right, let's kick this thing off. So first of all, I'm just going to introduce what desired state configuration is. I know some of the people in the chat room or in the call here have definitely started playing around with this and are familiar with it, but just to get everyone on a basic level of understanding, what makes up desired state configuration as the Windows feature or as the thing that's shipping from Microsoft right now? There's a couple main components. The first is the local configuration manager. That's the local agent on the box that actually does all of the processing of the configuration documents and coordinating the execution of the resources that actually do the work. The next part of DSC is this pattern for implementing these extensions that we call resources. And basically, there's a structure with a given naming pattern of get target resource, set target resource, and test target resource. And as long as you can come up with some PowerShell that offers those three commands, you can make a DSC resource. Third component is a DSL, a domain-specific language, used for authoring configuration documents. These are extensions to the PowerShell language that allow us to translate PowerShell into this MOF syntax that the DSC, the local configuration manager, the DSC agent needs to actually create the configurations. Now, the sweet thing about this is these configuration documents are authored in PowerShell, and so we have a lot of the constructs that we'd want to use from PowerShell available. So we can do conditional logic, we can do ifs, thens, whiles, we can do for eaches, and all sorts of filtering. So in our configuration generation process, we can add some logic to it. Once that configuration document is generated, that is the blueprint. There isn't the conditional logic that happens, on the agent side outside of what the agent does with each individual resource. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then the final component is this minimum viable product, or proof of concept style central server called the pull server. And basically, it's a REST endpoint that serves files, and that's pretty much about it. There's a basic compliance endpoint, but it's really there to serve up those configuration documents, so you can basically prove that this thing works and get a minimal implementation up and running. We'll look later at some of the things that might be missing from that, and what you might want to look for in a full solution. All right, John's chipping in is finding the compliance servers useful, and it does have some use. It's not totally useless. It's just not as full featured as stuff from other configuration management products, things that are actually a full end-to-end solution. But it's definitely a starting place. So about a year or so ago, Windows Server 2012 R2 preview build was available. It was sometime after Build and Tech Ed that year. And being the glutton for punishment that I am, I decided to roll some of that out into production. Now, I didn't do this willy-nilly. I had support from Microsoft through the Windows Server Early Adoption Program. So it wasn't, just fully going off and being a cowboy and rolling out beta software into production without a net. I did have some help, but I was getting it out into production. So when I was first evaluating how am I going to use this feature, on the Linux side of things, we use Puppet at Stack Exchange, and we had already had a good implementation of Puppet there when I started, and so I didn't really know how they kind of got started with it, and where they started with getting the servers kind of under control. And so I kind of thought about it for a bit, and I'm like, what are my big pain points, or what's tough for me with server configuration? And at Stack Exchange, it's a very, very quick environment. There's a lot of change happening all the time. So we're constantly building new servers, deploying new servers, changing configurations. And so we had this checklist. All right. So let's pick back up here where I left off. My challenge was we had these checklists, And, I mean, I've been in environments that have had worse checklists, but there were basically 30 items that we had to do every time we deployed a Windows server. When we deployed a Linux server, we had the same checklist, but there was only 4 items. You know, it was, is it in the configuration management database? Is it in the monitoring system? Is it configured in Puppet? And then I always forget the 4th one. So I wanted to get our Windows deployment basically to that. Basic server configuration stuff, setting power plans, setting the page file sizes correctly, getting some of the basic roles installed. Like, for example, our monitoring system at the time required SNMP. So make sure SNMP is configured, make sure it's got the right community strings and that kind of thing. I also wanted to make sure that a custom module that I'd written was available on all our servers. You know, we had a Stack Exchange module that had some custom functions that we would normally use, you know, for a PowerShell prompt. So make sure that that's out and currently up to date. And there were a couple other things on that list as well that I was going to automate away. So that's kind of how I started. And if you're looking at DSC to get into it, that's a great place to pick, because one of the dangers in going into a configuration management product is trying to go whole hog and do everything you can't deploy DSC until you can do absolutely everything through it. If you have the resources, that might work. But if it's going to, if that's going to be an impediment, desired state configuration actually lends itself very well, and configuration management tool, these declarative configuration management tools in general, they lend themselves very well to incrementally building your infrastructure. So you can start with a couple of things, get them under control, and then start evolving and keeping moving forward with that. So I had my starting place, and as I was, working my way through that stuff, DSC was starting to get a little traction on my team, and I had to make sure that when or if I wasn't there, how do I make it so that my team can all work on this and not just me? And so there are a couple of things I had to address. All right, great question. Good question, Matt. So Matt said, when I started, I probably already had a lot of things set by GPO, and wouldn't I want to avoid overlap? Yeah. So yes, there were some things, and I would transition them out from GPO for a couple of reasons. So my GPOs were actually part of my target list of things to attack with DSC, and for a couple of reasons. I've had GPOs kind of go wonky on me if a machine fell out of scope for some reason, maybe a WMI filter or something like that. Group policy processing also adds a little bit of overhead. It's probably a wash with the DSC checks, but you still have that and you also still have that domain requirement. And we were at the time also talking about possibly splitting our internal and production domain, our internal and production. We were talking about possibly scaling out data centers across the country or across multiple countries, and having a domain dependency for that configuration was less and less attractive, and DSC doesn't have that dependency. The other thing, the other main reason is GPOs, while you have some nice tooling for them, if you actually go down and look at the files, it can be very difficult to understand what's actually going on in the GPO from the documents, and it's hard to version those unless you have some additional tooling that's doing that. With DSC configurations, they're plain text documents. I can stick them into source control. I can diff different versions. I can diff different servers. with some text tools like WinMerge or Beyond Compare. And so DSC just made it a little more accessible to my team. It also didn't have a dependency on Windows as far as editing configuration files. Now, if you wanted to generate them, yes, you had to have PowerShell. But most of my team at the time used Macs as their primary workstation. And if you had a text editor, you could tweak settings without having to RDP to a box to do something. So from a workflow perspective, for us, DSC fit our model better than group policy. So, talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about that workflow as well here. And that's kind of what I'm leading into. So I looked at how we were doing our Puppet configurations, and basically we had a repository in our source control system that we had a build server that watched it. And anytime somebody checked in something to that repository, a build would run, and it ran a script basically to check syntax and run some tests to make sure that everything was going to compile syntactically correct. And then it would push it out to the Puppet server to distribute to our Linux nodes. Well, I wanted that same feel for my team for desired state configuration, so that there was as little of cognitive dissonance in switching between tool chains as possible. So, first thing I had to do is make sure that there were no magic people or machines in the process. Being able to generate desired state configuration documents had to be able to build on any machine anywhere without relying on any special settings. Whatever process did the build, or whatever script ran to do the build, had to be able to either get those resources, or they had to be contained in the repository with them in order to make the thing work properly. It also couldn't rely on any particular people, and it had to run under a service account. With having it run under a service account and not tying it to a particular user account, that means that if, for example, I left to work at Chef, that the builds wouldn't stop when they disabled my user account. Or if I was hit by a bus, or maybe they didn't like me anymore. That the configurations wouldn't stop just because I wasn't there. So those were the first two things I had to tackle. And that's harder than you think, because when you first start putting something together and you're building functions and scripts and configurations and you're working on your local machine, you forget all the customizations you've done to your local shell to make things happy, and what's all on your PS module path, and what's available there. It's when you go and you try to run that on some other server that's not customized to your liking that you find out what tweaks you've done and what you've assumed was present and things like that. So that was the process to make that thing run. And then now, because it's running kind of an automated fashion, where it's watching the source control directory and you have this build process that runs kind of unattended, you have to make sure you have enough logging in the process that if something goes wrong, you can troubleshoot it, and that you have enough error handling so that not errors that shouldn't stop the process don't, and errors that should do, and that they return the right results so that the build server can say if something succeeded or failed. So there were definitely some challenges in that process, but it's all entirely doable. The other good thing about that process is, while we didn't have a whole lot of process overhead at Stack Exchange, you could definitely extend that process to fit pretty much any regulatory or process environment. And if you need to have sign-offs in between things, or have it go through different phases of approvals, or different phases of environments, like going from a development to a staging to a production environment, you can definitely add those phases into this build process and follow a similar pattern and just extend it with the approvals that you need. Most systems allow you to plug in, or you could use a workflow orchestration engine like Orchestrator or something like that to tie into that. So that handles the build process. The next thing I had to deal with was dealing with how do we make sure that everybody has the most recent copy of the configuration scripts, how do we make sure that there is a single source of truth for our build servers to pull from, and that people aren't overwriting each other's changes. Well, at Stack Exchange, that wasn't so much of a problem because we were already heavy users of source control. All of our scripts, all of our Puppet configs, they were all in source control. Initially, we used Mercurial, and eventually we switched to Git. And so that helped us make sure that everybody had the most recent version. If they tried to check in an old version, they'd say, hey, you got an old one, pull down the new stuff and make sure it's correct, or make sure you merge correctly. And then the build servers would always have this central version to go look at from that was residing on our source control server. They could pull from there and run their configurations against that. And that was the single source of truth, not what was on anybody's individual laptop. There was kind of this unwritten rule that nobody pushed configurations into production from your workstation. They were always generated by this process. So that we had this logging, we had this audit trail of changes that went through. Not necessarily go back and blame somebody for a problem, but so that we could see what happened. So if we had a production incident, we could go through and figure out what changes recently happened and see if that was a problem. So one of the things I didn't really define beforehand was build, or what a build is. And because we were using source control systems and because we were a software development shop, we had a build server handy and with a bunch of build agents. And a build server is basically a development version of an orchestration server. And usually they're less expensive. They might have they have a little different purpose than orchestration servers, but they also do a lot of the same things. And so for us, for this DSC process, the build server was just the thing because it knows how to talk to source control systems, and it knew how to run PowerShell scripts, and it could farm the job out across a number of different nodes and different data centers. And so it worked really well for this process. Plus, it had hooks to tie into our chat system, so it could say, hey, I'm building, so everyone knew that something was happening. And we were able to march right on. So that's what I mean by a build. So the build is the process by which our configurations were generated, or by which my resources were actually zipped up and named appropriately to be put out on the Pulse server. So whenever I say build, that's the process I was talking to. And now, Dave, we will be moving on slides. I'm a little long-winded if you haven't gotten that before. So the next thing that I had to deal with, or the next kind of hurdle that I came across, was Dave was asking if I left it on that if his screen had frozen up or if I left it on that slide very long. So yes, I left it on for quite some time. So I had to deal with versions, and versioning is extremely important when it comes to DSC resources, because DSC resources, when they're generated, they have that module version. Now, the module version for a resource is the module version of the module that contains the DSC resource. DSC resources themselves in structure are a module, their version is irrelevant. It means nothing to nobody. The module that matters is the module that has the folder DSC resources that contain DSC resources. So if I have a module called the Stack Exchange Resources, and it has 5 or 6 DSC resources in a folder called DSC Resources, the Stack Exchange Resources module metadata file is what will be looked at for module version. When the local configuration manager gets a configuration document, it needs that exact module version to be available on the node in order to process that configuration. Now, if it doesn't have it, and you're in a pull server mode, it can go ask the pull server for that module version. But if it's not available, if it can't get it successfully, it will fail to run. Doesn't matter if it's a newer version on the local system or an older version. The other key thing to remember here is if you change the functionality of a resource and you don't change the version, and you're using a pull server environment, that changed resource will not go out. It won't be. The old version that exists out there will satisfy people, or will satisfy the requirements of the configuration document. So versioning was very, very important. That leads to a little problem, though. And one of the first question here: can a pull server host module host multiple versions of the same module or resource? Yes, David, they can. So when you package a resource for the pull server, it's named. It's just a zip file with the module name underscore module version .zip, and since you can have multiple, you won't have name collisions, you can have multiple versions of that same module on the server as long as the version number is different. And Matt comments that he's not used it in the real world yet, DSC in the real world yet, but it sounds like there's a lot more moving parts. Yes and no. There are definitely some idiosyncrasies, but there's only a handful of places that there's going to be problems. When you start talking about full end-to-end solutions, yes, there can be a lot of moving parts, and as you scale the process, the configuration generation and that whole process around that can definitely have a lot of moving parts, especially as you have more process around it. So the less process you have, the more streamlined the process you have, the less moving parts, the less complex. From the local configuration manager to applying a configuration, that's actually a pretty straightforward process. The resources themselves could be complex, and that's just troubleshooting PowerShell. But the agent part of it itself is pretty focused. Once you catch some of these these little gotchas. So I hit the first kind of worrisome bug for me at that point. So I mentioned that DSC is good for iterating on your environment. And one of the things I was doing is I was generating a lot of module versions. And so I might rev a module 3-4 times in a day. So what came up was, and this is a problem with WMF4, I had set the local configuration manager to allow module overwrite. So that meant the pull server could give me a module, and then the local DSC local configuration manager should pull that module down, unzip it, and overwrite the existing module. And So, Matt mentioned as deploying changes 3 or 4 times a day. It's not as big of a deal as you think. You make a small tweak and you deploy it. That's the concept around continuous delivery, is that you can, instead of packaging up a whole ton of changes to deploy all at once, tweak one little thing, deploy that change, make sure it applies fine. Deploy the next change, make sure that applies fine. And by reducing the size of the change sets, you can troubleshoot a lot faster if something does go wrong. You also have a process that you've used time and time and time again to make sure that the delivery process is solid. And that's actually why I found this bug. So back to the bug. So setting the local configuration manager to allow module overwrite allows for the local configuration manager to overwrite the existing module with the newer one. Well, in actuality, what it was doing was it was taking the existing module, renaming it _temp, and moving the new module into place. And it never cleaned up after itself. And so the next time, the first version of the module downloads fine. Second version, rename the first version with _temp and copy down the second version. When I apply the third version, it tries to rename the first one with _temp, and that fails because there's already something with _temp there. Then the local configuration manager fails. This was a major problem, especially given that one of the strengths of DSC is supposed to be that I can iterate on my environment so much. So I had a choice. I could change my module names. I could do whatever. I just had a process then that I would actually periodically go through and delete all the the module _temp folders in program files, Windows PowerShell modules. So Matt followed on. He's from an environment that's more traditional with big bang releases, and being able to rev multiple times a day would be a dream. Yeah, that unfortunately, the big bang release is a very common pattern. But being able to it's starting to be shown. There's research now that's out there showing that these small incremental releases are actually much less risky and offer much better return on investment than kind of these big bang releases. But a lot of our SLAs and a lot of our contractual obligations have us locked into this now, where we have these big bang releases, or pain in the past with a release. We want to do it less often, and so we don't make changes, and we fight to keep our environment stagnant, because the fewer changes, the fewer things that can go wrong. Well, if I have the capability to evolve my infrastructure and solidly deliver changes, something goes wrong, I can change it easily, because I don't have to wait 6 months to deploy the next version. I don't have to live with that pain for 6 months. Being able to, or having something come up because of a change, or having a problem because of a change, doesn't mean I'm stuck with that for very long. If I know I can get a version, if I know I can change my configuration back in 30 minutes, or 10 minutes, or 5 minutes, it's much less of a deal to deploy multiple times a day. But this bug would stop me from it. Oop. All right, the next step that I came across was dealing with configuration data. And if you've seen DSC demos before, you've probably seen configuration data that looks kind of like the slide on the screen. We have a configuration data hash table. Inside of it, there's an array called all nodes that has a couple of hosts and maybe a little bit of metadata around them. And that works great for demos. That works great for a little proof of concept. It doesn't work so great when you start wanting to pass in a whole lot more information into your configurations. When you start wanting to pass in things like websites that a service should be running and which database hosts are supposed to be talking to and which logging servers they're supposed to go to and what power plans should be used and what their page file sizes should be and all these different configuration options, what their execution policy should be. You don't want to necessarily hard code all of that into your configuration document, because if you have a configuration document that you can push all this information into, then that configuration document just represents the structure, and I can change based on environment what data I pass in. So Zoo, is that I'm probably mispronouncing your name, and if so, I apologize. Asked, he's a developer, so he asked if there's an extension point that we can write to overcome the and we could hook a file system launcher in to remove underscore temp. I believe PowerShell version 5, WMF5, actually the local configuration manager with that actually solves that problem. But as that's not released yet, there's some previews out that doesn't solve that. A scheduled task to go and watch and to remove. My deployment wasn't big enough that I couldn't hold that temporarily. But yeah, my plan was just to wait for them to fix it, to keep the pressure on Microsoft to fix it. And it looks like it is being fixed in WMF5. But yeah, there's a myriad of solutions you can come up with. The pain point was you didn't know that was the problem until you brought out Procmon and watched what was happening when the thing tried to actually deploy that, when it tried to pull down the new module. First, I thought it was that maybe my folder, my zipping of the doc. Because here's another little tricky bit. When you zip the DSC resource, how you zip it is important. And if you use 7-zip, it's probably not going to extract properly. If you use the desktop version of compression, of compression, that tends to work just fine. And so automating the desktop com object to compress the file, that works. So that's the method my build process would use. And so I was thinking, maybe there's a problem with my zip file, so troubleshooting the issue took a little bit, and so that's why I call it out, because it's not super obvious as to what's actually happening there until you actually watch what's going on. All right, back to configuration data. So this common structure that we see for samples, it quickly grows out of proportion, because you see things that, if I, for example, both those web servers in there, if I wanted to assign power plans to them of high performance, I wanted to pass that into my configuration, I would have to duplicate that in each node. And that quickly becomes difficult to scale. With a handful of nodes per sample, no big deal. But when you start talking about real servers, it becomes more of a problem. Dave comments, let's normalize your hash table. It's kind of like that. I call it refactoring, but yeah, it's basically pulling out duplication. And, so if you're familiar with normalization in database land, it's a similar process. So I actually ended up creating a little structure for I ended up creating a structure for my module metadata, and I ended up creating additional hash tables under configuration data. Because configuration data is just a hash table, we go back to the previous slide here. Configuration data is just a hash table. The PowerShell team already made all nodes and created especially a configuration document. And they've asked that we leave alone any keys that would start with a PS. That's their prefix that they're going to keep. But other than that, it's kind of the Wild West for us to create keys, because this configuration data gets passed into our configuration document and is available for us then to use. So I started adding to the configuration. The first thing that I added was a sites key, so that I could have data that differed between my data center in New York and my data center in Oregon. So after I had my sites data added, I found that I needed to start creating some roles for my servers to have. And because once I got through automating my base configurations for servers, I found that I was ready to start tackling some of the configuration around our roles that our servers take on in our environment. So we had web servers that serve production traffic. We have dev environments, SQL servers, and file shares, and service box, like middle tier app layer boxes. And so with that, I created another key called services, and then underneath sites and underneath services, I would just have hash tables there with additional metadata. And as I started creating these different hash table structures, I needed to come up with a way then to find that information without having to have the hash table structure written out in my configuration document. And the reason that I wanted to do that was so that I could also supply overrides, because one of the great things about having this infrastructure like this is when I want to test something new, I could pick a subset of servers and apply a policy just to those and override what the existing settings are, so I could try tweaking different settings and experimenting and doing stuff like that. So I basically had to come up with the hierarchy of how things would, or for how my configuration document should actually go looking for values from that hash table. And so I came up with this hierarchy, and it worked pretty well for my environment. Basically, I had services, I had sites, and I ended up adding there's a credential store and applications, but they follow the same basic pattern. And the configuration data and tell it, yes, it's a web server, so I'd say services web server, and then I'd say I'm looking for power plan. And that function would go and it would search this hierarchy, and it would check the node to see if there was an override at that level for the web server service, looking for the power plan. If nothing was there, then it would go up into my configuration data and take a look and see if there was a service-defined. Oh, I just noticed 2 and 3 are actually flipped. First, we check the site and see if there was an override for the site, because I could then specify settings. Say I wanted to test something in one data center and not another. I could set an override at the site level. I'll change that slide before I publish it. Then it would finally go up to the service default. Well, if I didn't specify anything at the service level, then I could fall back and just look for the property name at the node, at the site, and then at this magical site that I created called all, which would just be default, values. And that structure worked for me, but if you take that idea, you can work with that and build whatever structure you might need to build out your environment. And actually, Puppet and Chef both have a similar concept of creating structured data like that. In Puppet, it's called Hyra, and in Chef, it's attributes. And well, actually, attributes and then data bags. Those two things kind of take on the same functionality as this configuration data structure. Excuse me. Once I dealt with having that structure for my configuration data, and I was adding in more and more service roles that our environment had, my configuration document was starting to get kind of long. Good. So Matt's got a good question here. He said it's a good concept, and did I happen to align with Puppet or Chef, or did it just happen to, or did I know it beforehand? I knew of their general structures. I hadn't really looked into them deeply, and mine kind of grew organically. But I think I was probably influenced by their structures, though I didn't look deeply at them. So I knew of them. I didn't know much about them, and it's kind of interesting how similar it ends up being. I might have been more influenced subconsciously than I might let on, but there's only so many. When you look at it, there are. There's one main thing that all of these solutions do, and it's you want to separate your structural configuration for how a machine, how resources should be applied to a machine, or which resources should be applied, and then what environmental data you want to influence that structure. So. And yeah, so now that I work for Chef, I've actually had a few people ask me, hey, should I start learning Chef? Should I spend time on DSC? If I'm looking to do configuration management, where should I spend my time? And if DSC is of interest, definitely spend the time on it. Even if you decide to go with Chef, and I think that's a good idea, because my job is to encourage that. But I want you to have what works for you, and I'll talk about this a little towards the end if we have some time. But with Chef, you can leverage DSC in whatever format, and whether it's your configuration script, whether it's your MOF documents, whether it's DSC resources, we're going to play in that sandbox. So the concepts around configuration management are very important, and they're very similar across all these products. So the time you spend learning DSC, even if you decide down the road to go with a full solution like Chef, you're not going to have wasted your time. So anyway, I began breaking up my configuration. I need to break up my configurations because the configuration document was getting way too long. It was getting there's a lot. If I wanted to change something on web servers, if I threw off a quote or a paren somewhere, then my whole document was suspect because unfortunately the configuration script doesn't always give you the best errors, and so sometimes troubleshooting those is a little tricky. I will give you a hint. If you're troubleshooting issues with the configuration generation, set your debug preference to continue. There are a lot of write debug statements in the configuration function in the PS desired state configuration module. But your configuration, when you create a configuration, it is similar to, but it is not a function. It does not, or it's not an advanced function. It does not have a debug or a verbose parameter. So set verbose preference to continue, set debug preference to continue, and you'll get a host of helpful information trying to troubleshoot where something went wrong in your configuration generation. So one way that we could break up configurations is to use composite configurations. Now, I didn't know about composite configurations at first, and so I was trying to split mine out into different PS1 documents, and I found out that didn't work so well. If I loaded different PS1 documents, if they weren't loaded in the same execution context, or if all of the configurations weren't generated kind of in the same pipeline, they couldn't pass parameters to each other. So so composite configuration, you can actually take parameters into it, and then your main configuration document treats them like a resource. But if you, say, load a PS1 file that contains a DSC resource or a composite DSC configuration, you just can't pass parameters to it. Well, little did I know, or I had started doing this before, but I was out in Seattle for a conference, and I'd stopped by the PowerShell team's offices, and I was talking with the team there about them. Like, well, why aren't you using composite configurations? And like the week before, they blogged about that, and I missed that, and so I quickly changed my PS1 documents there to composite configurations, treated them like DSC resources, put them in a DSC resources folder, gave them a module metadata file, and changed the PS1 documents to a schema.psm1 document. And lo and behold, I have composite configurations. And composite configurations just make it a lot cleaner for creating configuration documents. It's just like creating a function in PowerShell. You pull out some common bit of code that you can reuse later, or that you want to simplify your main script. So the downside is something I'll come to a little bit later. I'll mention a little bit more, but there's an issue with with setting dependencies and using composite configurations. That's supposed to get fixed with V5. I haven't loaded the experimental V5, the latest preview yet, but it was not fixed in the May preview. So we'll see. We'll see if they get that thing fixed. The team's gotten a lot of feedback about that one, though, that's important. So I'm sure they'll get it before V5 makes its final appearance. So now I'm cranking out versions of of resources, and I've got a nice automated build process to do this, and I've got it set up so my team can contribute. And I'd made a handful of resources, and I was using the inbox resources, and it's like, well, what are going to be the thresholds that I set for what is allowed to be pushed into production as a resource? And the PowerShell team had released a resource kit that had a module called the DSC Resource Designer. And in it is a command test DSC resource, which actually does some basic validation checks. It makes sure your schema.mof document matches, which contains basically the mapping of your parameters for your function, your resource functions, to the WMI types that they need to be, because the local configuration manager is actually a WMI agent. So make sure the schema.mof matches your parameter sets and that the parameters are attributed right, and just some basic linting or style checking to make sure that things are proper for it to function as a resource. And with that, with adding that into my build process, I could make sure that everything worked just fine, or that everything should work fine, or should actually be able to load and execute as a DSC resource. I also started to add in some pester tests so I could make sure that my logic was sound, especially for things like creating power plans or changing the power plans or page files. Those are making major changes to the system state, and I want to make sure that that I'm evaluating things correctly before I actually start to do things. This type of stuff is very important because resources run mostly unattended as system on your box. So if you have buggy logic, if you're making the wrong calls, you can unleash a lot of hurt in your environment if you do not test this stuff. If your logic isn't sound, if you haven't tested in a sandbox environment before, you're going to have issues. And the other important thing is, again, this thing is running unattended. DSC logs the event log. If you run it interactively with start DSC configuration, or you manually hit the SIM endpoint or the WSMan endpoint to kick off a pull of the DSC configuration, the local configuration manager, to go and get a new config from the from the pull server, it will return in real time or near real time all the log messages from write verbose. So write verbose all through your resources, every step that you might want to see, is very, very helpful. So I quickly learned more after going back and adding write verbose statements many, many times to resources. Now it's by default. Almost every single major section of the logic kind of has an entering and an exiting. And if you're running a build process, you have the same thing. You want to have a lot of log statements that you can turn on, that if something is going wrong, you can easily see, because these processes run unattended. So now I've kind of made it through the hurdle of getting DSC into my environment, dealing with some of the procedural and technical issues, and now I kind of have to adjust and get my team to adjust and our developers to adjust to the fact that we should now be making changes to our servers via configuration management. That means when we need to make new changes or deploy new types of servers, it might take a little bit longer at the beginning. but it's going to definitely speed up when we have to stand up matching versions of that same service in our DR data center, or when we need to recover because a machine failed, or because at Stack Exchange most of the critical stuff ran on physical hardware. If physical hardware failed, we got a new box. And if we needed to spin something up in the meantime as a VM to kind of patch it, well, how do I get the config down? Do I have to go find a document somewhere, or can I just apply my configuration management to it? We definitely learn to trust our source control, check in regularly with good commit messages. And we really had to fight this urge, like, oh, well, I'll just go change the firewall rule here once, and then I'll go back and add it in. If you don't stick a ticket in your ticketing system, or an item on your Kanban board, or a big note to yourself in Outlook to go and make that change where you'll actually go and do it, you really have to fight that urge to, I'll just do it this way once, because you'll forget. I forget. If I don't write it down, if I don't put it on one of my to-do lists or Kanban boards or whatever I'm using that day to try to make myself productive, then it very often gets lost in the avalanche of work that we do. As systems administrators or as developers, there's always stuff going on, and it's really easy to forget about that one firewall rule you enabled. This just happened to us when we did the failover for our data center move. We found there were servers that we hadn't set back up since before I started there. And when we built new 2012 R2 boxes to take over that functionality in our DR data center, until we went to test the apps, oh yeah, we need a firewall rule here. Oh yeah, we need a firewall rule there. For these services, it wasn't documented anywhere. It wasn't part of a configuration script because we didn't have one at the time. And so those things very quickly made their way into DSC configurations. And thankfully, we built a firewall resource, and so we could solve that one right away. Another thing that got left out is on our domain controllers, which are DNS servers. We changed the netmask filtering for netmask ordering for DNS servers, so that returns all of a class 16 and not just a /8. I don't know if you know, Microsoft DNS servers by default will prefer to return values if your requesting address and their address are all in the same /24, you'll get back that address. It'll prefer to give you that address rather than DNS round robin. But if you can change that netmask ordering, and since our data centers were partitioned /16, we changed it to a /16. All right, question from Matt. You expect businesses and managers to be pushing their IT staff to use DSC because it reduces tribal knowledge, makes it repeatable, protects the business. What he sees, though, is the move at the moment is efforts to move to DSC being technical folk. Is that what I'm seeing? And should managers know as much as do senior IT managers know as much as they should about DSC? I think it's still very early in the learning curve on that. Technical folk, we tend to watch the bleeding edge, and so, and those of us who live on the bleeding edge tend to surround themselves with folks who are on the bleeding edge, so it feels like everybody's talking about this. But I actually think DSC is actually being talked about more so, in a faster fashion than, like, say, PowerShell was. PowerShell is really starting to now make its might felt in different environments. But it took a while for that to take hold. and I'm seeing a lot more interest, even in large companies and from senior IT folk, in this. The technical people at the pointy end who have to implement this stuff, we like it because, number one, it makes it easier to make changes in our environment, but it stabilizes our environment. Even though we might be changing it faster, it stabilizes our environment and it makes things more visible. So it means we can stay home more, and our phones aren't going to blow up as often with alerts. By stabilizing our environments or being able to recover from a failure. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But recovery from a bad configuration, there's some fun options there. I definitely think there's more to be learned by senior and by regular line IT folk around DSC, around declarative configuration management in general. I like DSC. I like Chef. I think you should take Chef. I think you should take Puppet. I think you should take DSC and give them all a spin. Both Chef and Puppet have hosted versions that you can try. Depending on your environment, you gotta see what's going to work best for your team. Ansible's another player out there. Try these tools. See what's going to work for your team. But I think it's definitely important to learn about this configuration management space and start applying some of these things. All right. This really, implementing this type of feature, implementing this declarative configuration management really gave us a new way to treat our servers. And I don't know about you, but I remember when I first started as an IT guy, I worked for a police department. I was a sole IT guy. I was responsible for all of our servers, all of our services. It had to be up 24/7. Got paged all the time because this application or that, whatever. But I remember much of what I did to stand up a lot of those servers. I remember, lovingly combing through the registry for the right settings to tweak, and editing permissions on different paths for different applications to make sure that they could be that they were going to run right. Going through 50 or 100-page Word documents for application configuration. After I had servers under config management, I could tell you what the config script looked like, but I would rarely, when I was standing up a server, actually log onto its console. You stop caring about individual boxes, and you start to look at ways that you can manage your servers without being on them, and how else can I make that experience better without actually having to get onto that box. If I don't have to log into that console, that's one less chance for some unplanned, untracked, unmanaged change to happen. I think it's Mark Burgess. He's kind of a luminary in the config management space. He 20 some years ago, he made one of the first products in this space called CF Engine. And he's got some good books out there that are really difficult to read, but are really good material. And, he says, as soon as somebody logs in interactively on a server, you've lost all ability to have confidence in the state of that server. So we start looking for ways, not just through configuration management, but through applications instrumentation and through providing good centralized logging tools, things like Splunk, or using Elasticsearch with Logstash and Kibana to create these central repositories of data that we can mine, alerting systems to tell us when things aren't behaving correctly, or when signs are starting to point that things might go wrong. And so once we stop logging in on these things, we stop developing these attachments to these servers. Like, oh, I always go to Web9. I have all the debugging tools set up just the way I like them, or I always jump onto SQL 04 because that's usually a secondary one, and so it's not a problem to get onto there and take a look at something. Once you start pushing off this and you stop actually going onto these boxes regularly, you start trusting your remote tools, you have much less attachment to these servers. And so if it's misbehaving, but everything else that's configured like it is doing just fine, chances are something got into that to change the state. And so, depending on how long it takes you to rebuild a box, you can kind of build this, this trade-off of, okay, if it takes me 4 hours to troubleshoot and figure out what's going on here, if I'm going to waste a day trying to figure out what's going on in this box, why not just grab the logs off the box? Or if I'm logging centrally, I don't have to worry about that. I've already got them. Rebuild the machine. If you have a good OS deployment pipeline, if you got WDS or System Center or something, and you can lay down an image really quickly, and you can take your DSC template and get that server back into fighting shape right away. For me, it was, if I was going to spend more than 20 minutes configuring something, I could have a physical web server back into production in about 20 minutes. If it was 2012, it took a little longer because there were more patches. But if it was a Server 2008 R2 or Server 2012 R2 box, I could have that thing into production in about 20 minutes from boot. And so if it was going to take me longer than 20, 30 minutes to troubleshoot something, make sure I had the logs, reboot, rebuild. And, when you show the capability to do that, now you have some ammo to go and say, hey, we need to be able, this is how we're treating our infrastructure. We need to have the capability in our applications to load balance across multiple servers. We need to be able to take servers out of rotation to do this, and we'll put the plumbing into, if I'm going to rebuild a box, I can take it out of load balancer, and so it's not going to cause any problems or anything like that. But you start looking at ways to make your infrastructure more resilient. And this helps prepare you for cloud if you want to go that route. If you want to go hybrid cloud, or if you're going in private cloud, or if you're going public cloud, having the capability to do that, to spin up nodes on demand and extend a service, or spin down nodes on demand, and have them configured the way you need to, this is the plumbing for doing that. You also have the ability then to stop caring about that, that one critical app running on that hardware from 2000 that is just kind of creaking away in the background there. If you can replicate that configuration, who cares what hardware it's running on? We can get our app back into production. Now, there's some things with hardware keys, and not every app supports this, and then you have to go beat up on your vendors if you can. But if you start moving this way and you start showing what these benefits are, you can show business value for doing this. Rebuilding becomes trivial. Very easy in a virtual cloud, but physical servers too. Like I said, Stack Exchange were mostly physical servers. I had no problem yanking a server out and rebuilding it. The exceptions would be our SQL servers, for example. There's a little more trepidation there, but even there, I could take a node down, rebuild it, add it back into the cluster. It was a little more work, but there was a trade-off. For the SQL servers, if I had maybe 3 or 4 hours of troubleshooting, maybe I'd lean towards rebuilding it. archiving solution. That was actually a project that was underway when I left. We were looking at using Logstash and Elasticsearch to store the logs in. It's a very similar concept to what Splunk does, but Splunk's got a lot more features on top of that. I've had so many issues with event log forwarding, I just don't trust it. But I haven't put a ton of time into it, so it could have been my issue. But yeah, we were playing with Elasticsearch and Logstash. Most of the work that I did, I would have to grab the logs before I would. That's why logging centrally is important, because it's an enabler from having to reach out to a box to grab those resources. It's something we were working towards when I left at Stack Exchange. I don't know how far along the road they are with that now. Probably a lot closer, and they move pretty quickly. Another thing that kind of came out of this was even more love for my version control system. I've been a big proponent of version control, I would say since 2007 or so. If you write PowerShell script, if you write VB script, if you write command scripts, if you write config files, you should be using version control. No ifs, ands, buts about it. There are free versions. There are free products. There are local products. There are paid products out there. There are enterprise solutions. There are open source solutions. Find one. I don't care what you use, as long as it's not source safe. It's a really old, deprecated solution. But find some source control and use it. I will go as far as to say I do not feel that you are doing your best as a professional if you manage some sort of text file documents like scripts, like config files, and you do not use some sort of source control. I will throw down a challenge. You should use source control. If you are not, I'm not going to beat up on you about it, but take this as an action item. Go and try some of it. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but it will save your brain. You will be very happy at some point in your life that you did this, because you will have versions over time of how files have changed. You will have authoritative versions you can go back to. Using a file share and having stuff .back1, .back2, .old, no, or having different, V1 folder, V2 folder, that is not source control. And so you need to figure that stuff out if you want to be a professional in this day and age. Yeah, file name with day, month, year, version. No, that's not. That doesn't cut it either, Milton. So, anyway, the other thing is, if you work with more than one, I would use source control even when I worked as a sole admin. But if you have a team too, this helps everyone stay in sync with what's happening. And so being able to keep in sync, being able to consistently or be able to contribute and allow people to change things and have a process for how that happens and have tooling to help make that easy, it will make your lives much, much easier. And when you have to go back 6 months down the road and say, what changed in our configurations, you'll have that record. So if you take anything away from this talk, take at least that. Learn about some version control. Try it and start using it. Pick one. I don't care what. If you like Mercurial, use it. If you like Subversion, use it. If you like TFS, use it. I don't care. Use something. So, I talked about, rebuilding nodes if something went kind of wonky, or where we might have a production issue, or maybe a drift of some sort that we weren't accounting for. One of the things with configuration management tools is that they are roll forward. You declare a state that you want it to get to, and it will get there. If I tell it if I want a default website to be running on port 8081, it will get it there. If I take that out of my configuration, that doesn't roll back that change. So unlike group policy, where it tattoos the registry with certain settings, and then if that policy falls out of scope, it reverts those to what the local box is already set to. That is not how these config management tools work. They get something to a state, and if you take them out of scope, if you don't have that policy being enforced anymore, it doesn't roll them back. It leaves them in that state. So you can, and actually a lot of resources have, they'll have an ensures parameter where you can say ensures present or absent, and that makes it easy to or for depending on the resource type, sometimes it doesn't make sense. But that makes it easy to roll back a discrete setting. But for complex configurations, it's a much more difficult story. Consider that we have a website configured. Matt mentioned that, asked is rolling back settings that are out of scope scenario for PowerShell workflows. That's one of the things that's exactly going to suggest. That is really more of a workflow type of scenario. So whether it's PowerShell workflows, whether it's similar orchestration engine, reverting those changes or rolling configuration back to some state is definitely more of an imperative task. It's not something that you want to have your configuration management system doing every 15 minutes or so. It's something you do once, and then you let your configuration management system take you somewhere else. The other solution is rebuild the box, because rebuilds are painless, because we can do them all the time. That's this ongoing theme in the continuous delivery cycles is if we do something often, or if something hurts, we do it more often. We find ways to make that process less painful, and then we can do it as frequently as we need to. Once we do it all the time, we're good at it, we're comfortable at it, we have good process around it. If I need to build servers all the time, I'm going to get some process around it. Makes it really, really easy. I don't want to feel pain all the time. I'm not wired that way. I don't like pain. I like challenge, but I don't like pain. And so, if rolling out a new server is really easy, then my desire to come up with some convoluted solution for rollback is going to be tougher than putting a new box into place. And so I'll put a new box into place. But, just to kind of illustrate why this is dangerous is, so I have my website installed. If I want to roll that back, how much do I roll back? Do I uninstall IIS? Well, what if I have other websites? Now I might have some competing order for how things are going to happen. I have one resource that goes and uninstalls IIS, then I have another one that comes and adds it back in. Now my box needs a reboot because I'm adding and removing features willy-nilly. So every 15 minutes, do I want my box rebooting because one resource is adding IIS and one's taking it out? Rollback is not as straightforward as you might think. So, what Matt was suggesting around the idea of workflows, Or you can go the nuclear route and just build a new box. Take the old one out, cycle the old one out. Or if it's physical and you need to maintain the node, just rebuild it. And so, you know, this is one thing that whenever I talk about declarative configuration management, this is one area that tends to catch people up, is they think, because especially in the Windows world where we have group policy and things that, you know, it changes state one way and then it changes back when it falls out of scope, we kind of expect that's kind of what our brains expect to happen. But that is not the case here. And so go in with your eyes open on this. So what are some of the things that I think are still missing in desired state configuration? One of the key concepts that you see both in Puppet and Chef is this concept of resource notifications. So for example, if I update a configuration file for a particular service, how do I tell that service that it needs to restart? Or if I update I can create another resource that's job is to run after that and to go and restart a service. But now I have to create these custom resources to do every single custom thing. Both Puppet and Chef have this concept that I can have, I can kind of say, if I run to make a change to a state, notify this other thing and tell it what to do. So I could say, you know, if I could have a file resource that if it runs to set thing, I could say, go tell this service to restart. So that's a feature I think we should see. I've been lobbying for that. I believe there's a bug on Connect about that. And I think the PowerShell team is going to be receptive to that idea. Centralized logging. You know, John Walls, I don't know if I saw him back in again, but you know, he mentioned that the compliance endpoint has been kind of helpful. I think there needs to be much more around that. It's definitely a start, but I think we need a better story there. And dependencies. I mentioned. That for dependencies we want, or that there was an issue with composite configurations and dependencies. So with dependencies, I can say this resource, my resource depends on this other resource, and so if that other resource doesn't succeed, mine won't run, and mine won't run until after that one succeeds. Well, we can treat composite configurations like resources except for setting dependencies. And that's a bug in V4, and supposedly it's being resolved in V5. We'll see. I hope so, because that's a real big one. John Walls is back, and he'd like to be able to apply and autocorrect some resources and apply and report on others. That's good. I like that. You know, to be just like having some resources flagged for just auditing, and having some to be auto-corrected. And then discovery of resources. In V4, your resources, composite or otherwise, have to be either in PS Home modules or env program files, Windows PowerShell modules. If you create a PS module path extension that the system can see outside of those, it won't find resources there until V5. It does work in V5 previews, but it does not work in V4. And there's probably still some other stuff there. Those are some of the highlights, though, of things I'd like to see, and some of the things that may be coming. 5. The last thing I really want to mention is that we do have a community repository that has custom resources. It's under PowerShell.org's name. Everything in there is MIT licensed, so that means you can take it and do whatever you want with it. We have resources I've contributed, resources from others. We're getting some great contributions and suggestions now from a bunch of community people. Dave Wyatt and Jason Walker have stepped up to help out with curating those resources, which is absolutely awesome. Dave's been very aggressive in helping out recently. It was totally cool. And if anyone else is interested in if anyone else is interested in helping out, I'm definitely I'd love to talk to you about it. And that's resources out there. Copies of the PowerShell Teams X resources, and then we have some other resources from the community. We're working on some documentation about how to contribute to the repository. How we want to see contributions come in. But we're always looking for bug fixes, or we're looking for bugs to be reported. And there's some tools out there too that kind of help, and trying to work out some documentation as well. Jacob Benson, I don't know if you're looking at DSC, if you haven't been following his blog, he's got like 35 or so posts about his process in looking at this and working with desired state configuration. And he's actually working his way through the tools now there, and I've been working with him to kind of clarify what I might not have made very clear. And between his posts and documents we're working on for the repository, we'll get some better guidance out around those as well. But if you're adventurous, we'd love for you to kick the tires. I will give a link to that blog. All right. I will have that link here in just a second. It's a nice obfuscated one, jacobbenson.com. And he has a work blog and a personal blog. It's his work blog. And let's see. He's got he's got a ton of posts out there for desired state config. So anyway, those are some of the community resources available. And last but not least, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Chef, and of course I'll take any questions that you guys have on DSC and Chef, whatever. But we recently announced exactly how our Chef integration is going to happen, and we made a cookbook available for people to try out how our integration is going to happen. It's actually going to be rolled into the next major. We're shooting to roll into the next major version of Chef, not as an extension, just as part of the what the native capabilities are. But they exposed it as a cookbook. It's open source out on GitHub, and a question from Greg Stewart, what's the LCM? That's the Local Configuration Manager. That's the agent portion of desired state configuration. That's the thing that actually goes and coordinates and does stuff. And John's asking when I'm going to work on the DSC ebook. I was hoping to have a chance to do it last week, and I ended up being in a training class, so it's on my list for very near future. Next week or two, I'm hoping to be able to spend some time with it. just how we're going to be integrating it. In Chef, you can natively use DSC resources as Chef resources in a very similar syntax to how Chef and DSC actually work. We'll also be able to take a mod configuration document that you've generated and apply that. And we can take a configuration script, a configuration function, and use that to apply. You do get, there's a very rich ecosystem around Chef. I'm going to be blogging a lot about that in the very near future. Some very cool test infrastructure to be able to spin up, like you could create a test matrix and say, I want to test my resource and this configuration 2008 or 2012 or 2, and maybe with different patches applied or different software applied, you can have these different virtual images, and you can create a test matrix, and then there's a test runner that goes and spins up all the images, applies the configuration, and will run the tests. And so yeah, there's really awesome tooling in this ecosystem around Chef that I'm going to look to see how much we can actually leverage as well, just with DSC. But the community around Chef is very heavy into this testing side of things, and it's really what you need to do when you're doing when you're doing kind of this declarative configuration management space. So, Chef then also offers a better cross-platform story. But there's nice UI, there's nice web UI, there's metadata search. So think about being able to do like something like invoke command and searching against all of the nodes in your configuration management database where they might have a particular app installed, or they might have a particular setting or IP address range. You could do all this. You can just kind of metadata search in Chef and then be able to execute commands against those. That's kind of cool too. And you can also use that metadata search in the configuration generation. So, but those are just some of the quick wins that you'd get, looking at working with Chef and DSC together. And that's it for my slide deck. And that slide deck is 20 slides in 2 hours. So, I can definitely, drop to a command line and show some stuff, or I can answer questions, or I can give you guys back the rest of your morning, whatever you'd like.
Thanks. Anyone have any questions for today? Either typing in or open up and ask. Either one. So Dave is typing a message. So
yeah, it's a couple of blur.
Furiously typing away. But yeah, that was actually a lot to take in. But I'll need to watch that at least 2 more times for sure. It was really good though. I mean, I've really only worked with this in like labs, not any kind of real world work yet. So I certainly heard a lot which I haven't encountered yet. Particularly if I go back to slide 9 or 10. 9 is pretty much how I'm working with it right now. So I'm certainly going to look into the example you used on slide 10 for sure. I just have a quick question as well. So with DSC and GPO, there's a lot of crossover. Do you have any kind of principle around when you would use one or the other? Have we lost him?
Sorry, I was answering, but I was muting myself.
Oh, okay.
I was actually looking to eliminate the use of group policy on my servers.
Okay.
And then John asked if I had a slide of the workflow, and I don't, but I should log that. And then Dave asked if the bug I referred to earlier with the local config manager failing to clear out the temp folders, if that happens in a single poll, or if it's only after a couple of. The first poll by a client will work. It's the third poll third and subsequent polls that would fail. Attempts to poll that would fail. So it won't actually fail until you've changed the version available to the configuration. So the client has to ask for different versions. So if you rev the version but you don't push a config that does not make it out to the client, then that doesn't really count. I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this name here. Mr. Moses, how about that? I'll go that route because I really don't want to mess your name up too horribly. He asked about the configuration store. How do I implement that? So there is a DSC configuration module in the community repository in the tools, and that has a command that is new DSC. Let me find it. I just ran it. New DSC configuration data store, and you give it a path, and it will create the folder structure for that. And then there are commands in that module for reading in and doing that. And basically what it does is it creates a folder structure. It's a bunch of how I created it was a bunch of PSD1 documents that contained hash tables, and this would read it and build up the configuration data hash table. You could store it however you like. You just need to be able to assemble configuration data to it. There should be a blog post coming out sometime in the near future on the Hey Scripting Guys blog that talks more about that configuration store in a little more general terms, and then I need to put some more documentation out more specifically about that. It's on my list. I definitely want to make that more clear. Let's see. John's been hearing a lot about some of the pieces, but is still not sure how to pull them all together. Yes, I need to get an end-to-end sample out there. And there have been a few people prodding me to do that and working on that. So I'm going to try to make that a priority next week. And then John also asked, what's the best way to make your custom resources write to the DSC logs? Rate verbose. So the operational DSC log doesn't get the rate verbose statements, but the analytic logs do, and you can turn those on whenever you need to capture them. But the rate verbose statements do come back if you do start-DSC configuration-verbose, or if you use from the DSC operations module in the community repository, there is a invoke DSC poll function, and that makes the client go pull from the pull server, and that returns the verbose messaging as well. All right, any other questions?
It looks like we might be out of questions unless anyone has anything else.
Milton's saving something.
Yeah. Furiously typing away over there. All right, okay, not a question.
Not a question.
Okay. Okay, then, so it looks like we're out of questions, but...
Oh, John's typing something.
Okay. What is the best way for people to contact you? Oh, hours. I've never heard of that.
Yeah. Seems interesting.
What is it?
So I can schedule a meeting with Steven. About DSC.
Cool. I'm not sure if we've lost him again, so, or he's muted.
Oh, yep. I had muted. Sorry.
Okay,
yeah,
no worries.
Yeah, Twitter, blog, and OHours are all great ways to get a hold of me. The OHours allows you to set up like either phone call or Skype. I'll also do. It doesn't have plumbed in Google Hangouts, but I do those as well, and just allows people to book some time and to know when I'll make some time available to chat about whatever.
That's pretty cool. I might check it out as well.
Yeah, and the ones that are out there now, I'm just kind of testing this thing out and seeing what times work. Depending on the feedback I get, like if people can't make those times or so, or there's a lot more demand in different time slots, I'm open to changing those around.
All right.
So one last thing I wanted to mention before we wrap this thing up is if you do want to take Chef for a spin, on learn.getchef.com, we actually have like a virtual lab you can do. And walkthroughs, and there's a whole little virtual lab that you can go through and spin a VM and try it all out. Yeah, right now it's just a walkthrough on Linux, but the techniques are the same and the concepts are the same. But we're working on the Windows walkthroughs. That's one of my jobs. is to help put that together.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much again. That was 2 hours of content, which I will certainly need to watch again at least twice. So thanks a lot for that. Again, for taking the time out and talking to us really late. I'm sure everybody here really appreciates it. So thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you guys. I appreciate the chance to share.
Awesome. Okay, thanks guys.